My husband tearfully confessed he'd been in love with my sister for years. He abandoned me, pregnant and alone, for a house in exchange for cutting ties. I walked away from everything, blocked them all, and rebuilt my life, brick by painful brick. This is my story. It wasn't the first time my world had been shattered. I learned early that life was a series of volatile explosions, not gentle breezes. Our childhood home wasn't a sanctuary. It was a battleground. A place where the air crackled with unspoken threats and sudden, unprovoked anger. Our parents, if you could call them that, were two broken people who saw children not as blessings, but as burdens, or worse, as convenient targets for their own frustrations. My mother's eyes, often glazed over with a dullness that spoke of too much wine, would sometimes ignite with a cruel spark. My father's booming voice and heavy hand were constant companions to my earliest memories, always just around the corner, ready to descend. In that desolate landscape, there was one constant, one beacon. Paige. She was 5 years older, but in truth, she was centuries beyond me in wisdom and resilience. While other girls played with dolls and dreamed of princesses, Paige was busy being my shield, my guardian, my real parent. She made sure I ate when food was scarce, that I was covered when the heat failed, that I wasn't alone when the fear became too much to bear. I remember one bitter winter night. The power had gone out, plunging our house into an unnatural darkness that amplified every creak and groan. Dad was in a mood, his shouts echoing from the living room. I was only 6, curled up tight in my bed, tears silently streaming down my face, too terrified to move. Paige, barely 11, slipped into my room, a shaky candle in her hand. She didn't say much, just climbed into bed beside me, pulling the threadbare blanket tighter around us. She wrapped her arm around my small frame, her touch a fragile but potent barrier against the chaos outside. "It's okay, Aude," she whispered, her voice a gentle hum against my ear. "I'm here, he won't get you." And she stayed there all night, her breathing a steady rhythm, her presence a silent promise that I wasn't utterly alone. She built a small, temporary fortress around me with her own body. Another time, Mom had gotten particularly angry over some spilled milk. An accident. A child's mistake. She was yelling, her face contorted, her hand raised. Before it could connect, Paige stepped directly in front of me. "Leave her alone," she'd yelled, her voice surprisingly strong for an 11-year-old, her eyes flashing with a protective fire I rarely saw in anyone else. Mom, startled, lowered her hand, then turned her rage on Paige instead. Paige took the verbal abuse, and even the occasional shove, without flinching, her gaze fixed on me, a silent message that she would absorb whatever came, so I didn't have to. She was my human shield, always. Our bond wasn't just forged in shared trauma. It was a tapestry woven with countless small acts of kindness and profound sacrifices. She taught me to read using old library books she snuck home. She shared her meager school lunch with me when I hadn't eaten breakfast. She even took on extra chores around the house, trying to appease our parents, just to create a momentary lull in the storm. Paige was the one who explained the world to me, who dried my tears, who made me believe that love, however fleeting, existed. She was my first, my truest protector, the one person I believed would never, could never, abandon me. Little did I know, the greatest betrayals often come from those closest to us, those we trust the most, and that even the strongest fortresses can crumble, not from external attacks, but from internal rot. Perhaps it was that inherent desire for an unbreakable shelter, so starkly absent in my youth, that drew me to Dean with such magnetic force. After years of navigating a world where trust was a luxury and safety an illusion, I craved the mundane, the predictable, the profoundly kind. Dean walked into my life like a sunrise after a long, dark night. I was working at a small bookstore, a quiet escape I'd found for myself, when he first came in, looking for a forgotten classic. He had a gentle smile, eyes that held genuine warmth, and a quiet confidence that was a stark contrast to the volatile personalities of my past. He wasn't loud or demanding. He simply times was asterisk. A steady presence that instantly put me at ease. Our initial conversations were tentative, then flowed effortlessly into hours-long discussions over coffee. He listened with an intensity that made me feel truly seen, something I hadn't experienced outside of Paige's unwavering gaze. Dean wasn't just attentive, he was times understanding asterisk. He saw the residual anxieties, the quick glances over my shoulder, the way I sometimes flinched at sudden movements, and he didn't question them. Instead, he created a bubble of calm around me, making me feel safe enough to slowly, cautiously, let my guard down. He was everything I ever wanted and never knew I deserved, a safe harbor in a world that had always been a tempest. Our romance was a whirlwind, swift and consuming. It felt less like falling in love and more like finally finding home. We moved in together quickly, nesting in a small apartment that, for the first time in my life, felt truly mine, truly ours. We spent evenings cooking simple meals, talking late into the night about dreams, fears, and the future we were building brick by brick. Dean would hold my hand across the table, his thumb tracing patterns on my skin, and I'd feel a peace so profound it almost hurt. He adored Paige, always complimentary of my sister's strength and intelligence, reinforcing my own love for her, and making me feel like our worlds were perfectly intertwined. He even managed to soothe some of the lingering resentment I held towards my parents. Not by excusing them, but by showing me what a truly loving relationship looked like. Our connection was deep, woven with shared laughter, quiet comfort, and the unspoken promise of forever. The day Dean proposed was etched into my memory, shimmering and perfect. We were on a hike, overlooking a vista of autumn colors, and he knelt, not with grand gestures but with quiet sincerity, a ring in his outstretched hand and tears in his eyes. My yes was immediate, breathless. Our wedding day was everything a girl dreams of, and more. It wasn't about the grand venue or the expensive dress. It was about the profound sense of belonging, of being chosen, of finally standing on solid ground. As I looked into Dean's eyes while exchanging vows, I believed with every fiber of my being that this was it. This was my happily ever after. My impenetrable fortress of happiness, built with love and trust, designed to withstand any storm. Life settled into a rhythm of contented bliss. We planned renovations for our first house, picked out furniture, dreamed of future vacations. Then came the news that sealed our joy. I was pregnant. The faint second line on the test stick felt like a miracle, a tangible manifestation of our love. Dean's face, when I told him, radiated pure joy, his arms wrapping around me in a hug so tight it felt like he was trying to absorb my happiness. We spent hours talking about names, painting a nursery, imagining tiny fingers and toes. Our family was growing, our future brighter than I could have ever conceived. I had everything I had ever wanted, a loving husband, a beautiful home, and a baby on the way. My fortress was complete, I thought. Strong, invincible. The first tremor wasn't an earthquake, merely a faint rumble beneath the foundations. So subtle, I almost missed it. It arrived with Carter. Paige, radiant and beaming, brought him into our lives like a burst of sunshine, her hand clasped firmly in his. She had met him through work, a charming architect with a quick wit and an easy laugh. Dean and I had heard all about him, of course, through excited phone calls and gushing texts from my sister. Now, it was time for the official introduction. A dinner at our house. The fortress of happiness we had so meticulously built. Carter was, by all accounts, perfectly likable. He was tall, with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor that complemented Paige's vibrant energy. He held the door for me, complimented my cooking, and listened intently as I recounted some innocuous story about my workday. He clearly adored Paige, his gaze lingering on her with an undeniable tenderness. Paige, in turn, glowed beside him, a happiness I hadn't seen in her since childhood shining from her very core. Seeing her so joyful filled my own heart with a familiar, comforting warmth. My sister, my protector, had found her own safe harbor. But as the evening progressed, a subtle shift in the atmosphere began to niggle at me. It wasn't anything overt. No harsh words or cutting remarks. It was Dean. My Dean, usually so effortlessly charming, so at ease in our home, seemed different. There was a strange stiffness in his shoulders, a slight tension around his jaw I hadn't noticed before. His smile, usually so genuine and warm, seemed to stretch a little too wide, held a fraction too long when he spoke to Carter. His compliments to Paige's fiancé felt less like sincere admiration and more like a carefully rehearsed politeness, a thinly veiled obligation. His eyes, normally full of gentle warmth, had a peculiar, almost guarded quality when he looked at Carter, a fleeting coolness that vanished before I could quite grasp it. I brushed it off, of course. Dean wasn't naturally effusive with strangers. Not like Paige. Perhaps he was just being protective of me. Of times us asterisk, especially with a new man entering my sister's life. Someone who would now be a permanent fixture, or maybe it was just the awkwardness of a new relationship dynamic. The natural male competitiveness simmering beneath the surface. It wasn't a cause for alarm, I told myself. Just a minor adjustment period. The idea that anything could genuinely threaten our perfect bubble, our impenetrable fortress, was unthinkable. My world was finally safe, anchored, secure. I refused to let a minor peculiarity disturb that hard-won peace. Yet, the feeling persisted. A tiny, persistent pebble in my shoe, subtly irritating with every step. I'd catch Dean watching Carter, not with curiosity or friendly interest, but with an intensity that felt almost analytical, discerning. Then, as if sensing my gaze, he'd snap back to his usual self, offering a casual remark, a reassuring squeeze of my hand. The inconsistency was jarring. It was a dissonant note I couldn't quite place. A faint whisper of discord in the symphony of our lives, one that subtly disturbed the perfect harmony I believed we shared. It was just a hairline crack, barely visible, on the otherwise flawless wall of my fortress. A tiny flaw, easily ignored, but once seen, impossible to truly unsee. It was the first sign that perhaps, just perhaps, my fortress wasn't as invincible as I had so desperately wanted to believe. The subtle unease I felt about Dean's behavior around Carter faded slightly as the weeks turned into months. Or rather, I consciously pushed it aside. The joyful anticipation of Paige's engagement party, held at a beautiful downtown restaurant, was too intoxicating to let nagging doubts spoil. It was a crisp autumn evening, the kind where the air holds the promise of winter, yet the glow of streetlights felt warm and inviting. Paige was breathtaking in a shimmering blue dress, her face alight with a joy so pure it brought tears to my eyes. Carter, ever the devoted partner, held her hand, his smile mirroring hers. They looked utterly, unequivocally in love. I smiled, raised my glass, and felt a rush of genuine happiness for my sister. My fortress, it seemed, was still intact, perhaps even strengthened by the presence of another happy couple in our lives. But as the night wore on, the hairline crack began to widen. Subtly at first, then with alarming speed. Dean, typically a moderate drinker, began to imbibe with an almost desperate enthusiasm. He laughed a little too loudly at Carter's jokes, clapped him on the back with a force that seemed almost aggressive, and kept refilling his own wineglass with a casual disregard for his usual limits. He wasn't overtly rude, but his charm felt forced, brittle. His eyes, though often fixed on me when he spoke, would drift, seemingly drawn by an invisible thread to Paige, lingering for just a fraction of a second too long before he'd snap back, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself he was simply celebrating too hard, overwhelmed by the emotion of the evening. After all, he adored Paige. Always had. This was just a release. Later, as we drove home in a silence punctuated only by the hum of the engine, Dean's earlier joviality had curdled into a sullen quiet. The warmth of the celebratory evening had vanished, replaced by a chill that had nothing to do with the outside air. He parked the car, but instead of getting out, he sat there, staring blankly ahead. His breathing was heavy, uneven. I reached for his hand, concern stirring within me. "Dean? Are you okay? You've had a lot to drink tonight." He flinched at my touch, pulling his hand away as if burned. Then, he turned to me, his eyes red-rimmed and bloodshot, but no longer merely drunk. They held a raw, agonizing pain I had never seen before, a tormented desperation that made my stomach clench. "Audrey," he choked out, his voice thick with unshed tears, ragged and broken. I can't do this anymore." My heart hammered against my ribs. Dread, cold and sharp, pierced through the carefully constructed calm I'd clung to. "Do what, Dean? What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, a frantic prayer that his words wouldn't confirm the amorphous fear that had begun to coalesce in my mind. He closed his eyes, a single tear escaping and tracking a path down his cheek. He took a shuddering breath, then another, before his eyes snapped open, locking onto mine with a horrifying intensity. "I'm in love with your sister," he confessed, the words tearing from him like a guttural scream. "And I have been for years." The world, my perfectly constructed, impenetrable fortress, didn't just crack. It exploded. It shattered into a million impossible fragments, each shard a reflection of a lie, a betrayal, a brutal, horrifying truth. The air was sucked from my lungs, leaving me gasping, suffocating. My mind reeled, struggling to process the impossible. Paige? Asterisk. My times Paige? The woman who had been my shield, my guardian, my truest protector? And Dean, my husband? The man who was my safe harbor? The builder of my happiness? Disbelief warred with a sickening certainty. "No," I whispered, the sound hoarse, pathetic. "No, you're drunk. You don't know what you're saying." But even as I spoke the words, I knew they were false. The pain in his eyes was too real, the raw agony in his confession too profound to be a drunken fabrication. This wasn't a mistake. This was a confession. Every tender touch, every shared laugh, every whispered promise, every single moment of our life together, replayed in my mind, twisting, distorting, taking on a grotesque new meaning. The subtle stiffness around Carter, the lingering glances at Paige, the strange guardedness. It wasn't awkwardness. It wasn't protectiveness. It was desire. It was a yearning that had festered beneath the surface of our marriage, poisoning everything we had built. My love, my future, my baby growing inside me. All of it was built on sand. A mirage conjured by a man who had loved another. My world, which had finally, blessedly, felt safe, was now a desolate, empty expanse, echoing with the sound of my own silent scream. My silent scream twisted into a choked whisper, then erupted into desperate questions, hurled at him like accusations, like pleas. "Paige? My sister? How long, Dean? How could you? Was any of it real? Was times ever real to you? All those years, all our plans, our baby, was it all just a charade? A means to an end? Tell me, was I ever enough for you?" My voice rose, cracking with each syllable, demanding answers that I instinctively knew would only wound me further. I clawed at the unraveling tapestry of our life, searching for a single thread of truth, a single moment that hadn't been tainted by this monstrous revelation. He just sat there, head in his hands, not meeting my gaze. His shoulders shook, but no words came, only ragged breaths and choked sobs that grated on my ears. When he finally looked up, his eyes were still red and swollen, but empty. There was no apology, no explanation that could possibly soothe the jagged tear in my soul, just a profound, devastating silence that spoke volumes. It confirmed every nascent fear, every horrifying implication. He couldn't deny it. He couldn't justify it. He simply times was asterisk, trapped in his own torment, leaving me to drown in mine. His inability to articulate anything beyond his initial confession was more cruel than any sharp retort. It was an admission that there were no answers, no defense. Only the bare, ugly fact of his betrayal. I couldn't bear to be in the same room, let alone the same bed, with the man who had just shattered my entire existence. The thought of his touch, his breath near mine, sent shivers of revulsion down my spine. "Get out," I heard myself say, the words foreign, metallic, as if someone else were speaking. "Just get out of our bedroom. Go to the basement." It wasn't a question but a command, delivered with a chilling certainty I didn't know I possessed. He didn't argue. He rose slowly, like an old man, and shuffled away, the sound of his footsteps on the stairs echoing like a death knell in the cavernous silence of our once happy home. The basement, usually a dusty storage space, became his cold, solitary exile. A physical manifestation of the chasm that had opened between us. The next few days blurred into a fog of pain so intense it felt physical. Every corner of our home, once a symbol of our shared life, and the fortress we had meticulously built, now felt poisoned, haunted by ghosts of what we once were. I walked through rooms filled with memories, each one twisting into an instrument of torture. The nursery, half-painted and filled with baby furniture we had chosen together, became a monument to a future that would now never be. The baby inside me, once a source of pure joy, now felt like a cruel irony, a living testament to a love that was a lie. Sleep offered no escape, only dreams filled with Dean's confession, replaying endlessly, each word a fresh stab. I couldn't eat, couldn't focus, couldn't breathe. My body ached with a profound, crushing weariness. A physical manifestation of the betrayal that had ripped through me. The world had gone from vibrant color to desaturated gray. A stark, brutal landscape mirroring the desolation in my heart. I was a casualty of a war I hadn't known. I was fighting, wounded beyond measure, and utterly, terrifyingly alone. In the suffocating silence of my shattered home, the crushing weight of betrayal wasn't confined to Dean. It twisted, insidiously, reaching out to grasp another unexpected victim, Paige. A resentment, ugly and irrational, began to fester in the deepest corners of my heart. A sour, poisonous tang that curdled every thought of my sister. How could this be? How could I, who loved her more than anyone, who saw her as my unwavering shield, now feel this corrosive bitterness towards her? She was innocent. I knew that. Dean's twisted obsession wasn't her fault. She hadn't sought him, hadn't encouraged him, hadn't even known. Yet, a part of me, a raw, wounded part that refused to be rational, screamed her name in accusation. It wasn't fair, not to her, not to the decades of unwavering loyalty and protection she had given me. But fairness felt like a forgotten word, a luxury I could no longer afford. Every time I pictured her face, radiant with happiness beside Carter, a cold tendril of anger would snake through me. Why times her asterisk? Why was times her times life blossoming while mine lay in ruins? Why was times she times the object of such fervent, destructive desire, while I was simply a means to an end? The girl who had once built a physical fortress around me with her own body, who had absorbed blows meant for me, was now, through no fault of her own, implicated in the destruction of the fortress I had built for myself. It was a cognitive dissonance so profound it threatened to fracture my mind entirely. I loved Paige. I cherished her. She was the only true family I had ever known. To resent her felt like a betrayal of my own, a desecration of the sacred bond we shared. Yet, the feeling persisted. A constant, low hum of grievance, an internal monster I couldn't banish, however much I pleaded with myself. It was an added layer of torment. Another facet of the pain I had to carry, knowing I was capable of such a dark, unfair emotion towards the one person who had always been my light. The air in our house, once thick with love, now felt thin, poisoned. Every breath was a struggle. I couldn't stay. The very thought of staying, of breathing the same air as the ghosts of our past, felt like a slow death. The fortress I had so carefully constructed, brick by brick, with Dean as its cornerstone, had crumbled, leaving me exposed and vulnerable. It wasn't just broken, it was tainted. Every object, every room, held a memory now warped by his confession. The sofa where we had snuggled, the kitchen where we had cooked, the bed where we had conceived our child. They were all monuments to a deception so vast, so cruel, that I couldn't look at them without feeling a fresh wave of nausea. It became terrifyingly clear that to heal, to survive, I had to physically remove myself from this wreckage. I couldn't rebuild on this poisoned ground. The idea, initially a desperate whisper in the darkest hours of the night, grew into a firm resolve as the days bled into weeks. I started with small, furtive mental exercises. Where could I go? How would I support myself and a baby? The practicality of it all was overwhelming. A mountain to climb while already exhausted and heavily pregnant, but the alternative, remaining here, a prisoner in my own demolished dream, was unthinkable. My coping mechanisms were rudimentary, born of instinct. I'd retreat into myself, listening to classical music or podcasts, anything to drown out the cacophony of my own thoughts. I started taking long, solitary walks, not to exercise, but to simply move, to put distance between myself and the house that had become my cage. I found myself sketching plans in a cheap notebook, mapping out fictional budgets, researching towns hundreds of miles away, places where no one knew Audrey, the betrayed wife, the abandoned mother-to-be. Each line drawn, each number crunched, felt like a small act of rebellion, a brick in a Times New Times kind of fortress, one built by me, for me and my child. But beneath this burgeoning determination, a profound, aching grief lingered. It wasn't just Dean I was mourning. It was the entire landscape of my future, painstakingly drawn, now erased with a single, brutal stroke. The dreams of our child, a family of 3, growing old together. The peaceful, ordinary life I had yearned for, they were ashes. I grieved for the girl who had believed in an impenetrable fortress, for the innocence I had lost, for the trust that had been so utterly shattered. The life I thought I had, the beautiful, safe, predictable life, was gone, and in its place, a vast, terrifying emptiness yawned, demanding to be filled, brick by painful brick, by a woman I was only just beginning to know. The nascent strength I was trying to cultivate, the fragile bricks of my new resolve, were still too weak to withstand the next tremor. It arrived, not as a rumble, but as a bright, joyful burst from the very person I had begun to resent. A text message notification, innocuous at first glance, lit up my phone one morning as I stared blankly at the half-painted nursery walls. It was from Paige. "Audrey, oh my God, I have the most amazing news. Carter and I were pregnant. I can't believe it. We're so happy." The words shimmered on the screen, each exclamation point a fresh stab. Paige, my sister, pregnant, happy. The juxtaposition with my own shattered reality was a physical blow. My own burgeoning life, once a symbol of hope, now felt like a lonely, unwanted burden, conceived in a lie. And Paige's, so openly celebrated, so purely joyful. A wave of the unfair resentment I'd battled surged through me, uglier and more potent than ever. It wasn't her fault, I knew. But the universe's cruel timing felt like a personal assault. I didn't reply to Paige. I couldn't. I just stared at the message, the phone feeling heavy in my hand, my own unspoken pain a counterpoint to her unbridled joy. The very air around me seemed to thicken with irony. Later that day, as I tried to distract myself with mundane chores, a cacophony erupted from the basement. Not the usual muffled sounds of Dean existing down there, but a furious, guttural roar, followed by the violent crash of something breaking. My heart leaped into my throat. For a split second, I wondered if he had found Paige's social media post, confirming what I already knew. Then, my phone rang. It was Dean. His name flashed on the screen, a chilling beacon. I hesitated, then answered, a cold dread settling in my stomach, knowing instinctively that this call would bring no solace, only further torment. His voice was slurred, thick with alcohol and raw, incandescent rage. "You saw, didn't you? You saw her announcement?" he bellowed, the words distorted by a potent cocktail of liquor and venom. There was no concern for my well-being, no whisper of regret for his past confession, only pure, unadulterated fury directed at an unseen enemy. "Dean? What are you talking about?" I asked, feigning ignorance, though I knew exactly what he meant. My voice was a thin thread of composure, barely holding against the storm brewing on the other end. "Paige, my Paige, pregnant, with his baby." His voice broke on the word his, dissolving into a heartbroken, infuriated wail that pierced my ears. "It should have been me. It should have been my baby. Our life. She was supposed to be mine." The revelation was like a fresh wound, deep and festering. Yet strangely, it brought a horrifying clarity. It wasn't about me. It had never been about me. The intensity of his despair wasn't for the marriage he had ruined, the family he had abandoned, or the child he had conceived with me. It was for the fantasy times he had nurtured, the stolen dream of a life with Paige that was now definitively, irrevocably out of reach. His tears weren't for us asterisk. They were for the loss of a life that was never even real. A life he had constructed in his mind, with Paige at its center. I stood there, phone pressed to my ear, listening to his drunken lament, and a chilling understanding washed over me. I wasn't a wife who had been betrayed. I was a prop, a stand-in, a convenient placeholder in a life he'd hoped would eventually converge with the one he truly desired. Our marriage, our home, our child, they were all just elaborate set pieces constructed to fill the empty space until his impossible fantasy could somehow materialize. He hadn't wanted me asterisk. He had wanted my proximity to her, my connection to her world. My heart, already in ruins, felt another heavy blow, not of sorrow, but of profound, icy comprehension. The fortress of happiness I believed we had built was never for me. It was a prison, designed to keep him, close to her, asterisk. And I, unwittingly, had been the architect of my own cage. The realization was sickening, turning my stomach with a disgust so potent it overshadowed even the pain. I was nothing more than a temporary means to an impossible end, and now that end was forever out of his reach. He had no further use for me. The silence that followed his broken sobs, before he abruptly hung up, was deafening. It resonated with the stark, brutal truth. I had been discarded, not because I wasn't enough, but because I was never the right person in the first place. The phone went dead, and with it, any pretense of his continued presence in my life. Even in the basement, I stood there, receiver still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone's monotonous hum, a sound that quickly became the soundtrack to his final, most absolute abandonment. He didn't emerge from the basement. He didn't try to call back. He simply vanished, leaving behind only the echoing silence of his last, cruel words. The hours that followed stretched into an eternity. I waited, a hollow ache in my chest, for the inevitable rumble of his car, the sound of his key in the lock, anything to break the suffocating quiet. Nothing. The house, once filled with the muted sounds of our separate existences, became unnervingly still. By morning, the realization solidified. He wasn't in the basement. His car was gone. His few packed bags, hastily brought down when I'd banished him, were gone too. He had simply walked away. Not just from me, but from our entire life, from the unborn child I carried, without a backward glance. Those first 3 days were a blur of agonizing stillness. Each tick of the clock was a tiny hammer blow against my fragile sanity. I moved through the house like a ghost, propelled by a morbid curiosity to see if he'd left any trace, any explanation, any sign of remorse. There was nothing, just the vast, cavernous emptiness where his presence used to be. My phone lay on the counter, a silent, mocking testament to the lack of communication. I checked it obsessively, irrationally hoping for a text, a call, anything that would prove I wasn't completely alone, completely forgotten, but the screen remained dark. The notification sound blessedly silent. Or perhaps, agonizingly so. Fear, cold and sharp, coiled in my stomach. It wasn't just the fear of being abandoned, though that was immense. It was the primal, visceral terror of being pregnant and alone, cast adrift in a world that suddenly felt hostile and unforgiving. Who would help me? Who would be there when the time came? Dean. The man who had promised to be my rock, my partner, the father of our child, had simply ceased to exist, replaced by a gaping void. The weight of his absence was a physical burden, pressing down on my chest, making every breath a shallow struggle. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, reaching out instinctively for him, only to be met by the cold, empty space beside me. A stark reminder of my new reality. Tears would come, hot and angry, but they offered no relief, only a further draining of my already depleted strength. With each passing hour of silence, the dawning realization became a crushing certainty. He wasn't coming back. There would be no heartfelt apology, no sudden change of heart, no desperate plea for forgiveness. His silence was his answer. It screamed louder than any words, proclaiming his complete and utter disinterest. His final rejection. He was truly, irrevocably gone. The dreams we had built, the future we had envisioned, the family we were supposed to be, all of it had been reduced to dust, and I, left standing amidst the ruins, was now completely alone, pregnant and reeling, left to pick up the pieces of a life he had so carelessly shattered. The task felt monumental, impossible. Yet there was no one else. Only me. Just when I thought the hollow echo of his final call had settled into a permanent, suffocating quiet, my phone vibrated. 3 days, 3 agonizing days of silence, and then, a blunt, soulless text message flashed across the screen. My heart, already a bruised and fractured thing, lurched with a sickening premonition. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that this wouldn't be an apology, it wouldn't be an explanation. It would be his final, definitive statement. The words were a brutal punch to the gut, devoid of emotion, clinical in their cruelty. I'll sign over the house to you. In return, I want no part in raising the child. No child support, no contact ever. Our slate wiped clean. I read it again, and again, the meaning sinking in like a lead weight. He wasn't just abandoning me. He was times buying, times his freedom, using our home as collateral for his paternal desertion. I was being discarded, and my unborn child, reduced to a bargaining chip, an inconvenient obstacle to be neatly removed from his life. A wave of nausea, more potent than any morning sickness, washed over me. I crumpled to the floor, the phone clattering beside me, my breath catching in ragged sobs. Asterisk. Worthless asterisk. That was the word that screamed in my mind. Not just me, but the tiny life growing within me. We were nothing more than a problem to be solved, an expense to be paid off, a loose end to be tied with a cold, legalistic knot. The pain was absolute, a searing emptiness that made my bones ache. I felt utterly, completely discarded, a piece of trash swept aside for a cleaner, unburdened existence. But then, a small, insistent flutter deep inside me, a gentle kick, a subtle shift that was unmistakably times her asterisk. My hand instinctively went to my belly, clutching it as if to shield the fragile life within. Asterisk no. Asterisk not worthless. Not my baby. This innocent life, utterly dependent on me, deserved better. deserved a protector. And with Dean gone, with Paige unknowingly implicated in my pain, that protector had to be me. A fierce primal instinct ignited within me, burning away the despair, replacing it with a cold, clear resolve. This wasn't about me anymore. This was about times her asterisk, my daughter, and I would fight for her, with every fiber of my being, even if it meant fighting alone. His offer, intended to sever all ties and erase his responsibility, suddenly looked different. It was a lifeline. A cruel, blood-stained lifeline, but a lifeline nonetheless. The house, our house, my house, now, was the foundation. It was a tangible asset, a key to a new beginning. Not on his terms, but on time's mine asterisk. He thought he was buying his freedom, but he was unwittingly handing me the tools to build my own. The tears stopped. My mind, which had been a chaotic storm, cleared, focusing with an intensity I hadn't known I possessed. I would take his deal. I would accept his poisonous exchange, and then I would make him regret the day he ever thought he could discard us so easily. I would rewrite our story. Not as a victim, but as a survivor. A builder of a new, impregnable fortress. Brick by painful, defiant brick. I would not just survive. I would thrive. For her, for myself. And one day, perhaps, I would even find a way to forgive myself for the unfair resentment I still held. A necessary evil in my quest for survival. The phone felt impossibly heavy in my hand as I stared at Paige's name, my thumb hovering over the call button. My newfound resolve was a fragile thing, forged in the ashes of betrayal, but it demanded this. I had to tell them, all of it. Not just for clarity, but for closure, and for the utterly necessary severing of ties that still bound me to the wreckage. Taking a deep, fortifying breath, I pressed dial. Paige answered on the second ring, her voice bright, bubbling with the happiness I had seen in her text. Audrey, I was just about to call you back. Isn't it wonderful? I can't believe it's actually happening. My carefully constructed composure threatened to splinter. This was the joy I was about to obliterate. Paige, I said, my voice flat, almost devoid of emotion. I need to talk to you. And Carter, can you put me on speaker? The sudden shift in my tone must have registered. A beat of silence, then her voice, laced with concern. Audrey? What's wrong? Are you okay? Is it the baby? Just put me on speaker, please. I heard the muffled sounds of her telling Carter. Then his deeper voice, equally concerned. Audrey? What's going on? Dean, I began, and the single word seemed to hang in the air, heavy with unspoken dread. Dean confessed something to me. After your engagement party, I recounted everything. My voice steady, dispassionate, like a prosecutor laying out a case. The confession of his long-standing love for Paige. The devastating silence when I questioned him. His move to the basement. I told them about Paige's pregnancy announcement. Dean's drunken, furious call. His meltdown over losing his fantasy. And the chilling realization that I was merely a placeholder. Then, I delivered the final blow. His 3-day disappearance, culminating in the text message, offering the house in exchange for abandoning all paternal responsibility. Each word was a fresh cut, not just for them, but for me. Reliving the agony. On the other end, silence. A stunned, horrifying silence that felt even heavier than Dean's. Then, a gasp from Paige, followed by a choked sob. No, she whispered, the sound ripped from her throat. Audrey, no. He couldn't have. This isn't real. Carter's voice was a low growl, laced with disbelief and fury. That bastard. How long? Paige, did you? No, of course not, Carter. Oh God, Audrey, I had no idea, not a single clue. How could he? How could Dean? I thought he loved you. He was always so good to you. Paige's voice broke into ragged sobs, raw and guttural. The image of her beloved protector, my radiant sister, crumbling into devastation, was almost too much to bear. He didn't, I stated, the brutal truth hanging between us. He never loved times me asterisk Paige. He loved the idea of times you asterisk. I was just convenience. A bitter laugh escaped my lips. He used me to stay close to you. Our whole life was a lie. A means to an end for him. More sobs from Paige, interspersed with Carter's furious curses. Audrey, I am so sorry, Paige wept. My God, what you've been through. This is unthinkable. I can't believe this happened to you. To us. I know you didn't know, I said, my voice softening just a fraction, acknowledging her innocence. And that's part of why this is so hard. I took another shaky breath. This was the hardest part. The line I had to draw. But I can't. I can't have this in my life anymore. Any of it. The betrayal, the lies, the constant shadow of what could have been. And for my daughter, I have to be completely free of it. The silence returned. Pregnant with a new kind of dread. Paige seemed to sense what was coming. What are you saying, Aude? She asked, her voice barely audible through her tears. I'm moving, I told her. The words firm, resolute, far away. To a place where no one knows Dean, or this story, or us. I'm starting fresh. For me and my baby. I paused, the next words tearing at my very core. And that means cutting ties. With Dean, obviously. But also, with you, Paige. A piercing wail tore through the phone. Sharper. More agonizing than any I'd heard from her before. No! Audrey, no! You can't! I'm your sister. Your only family. I didn't do anything. Please, Aude! Don't do this! Her pleas were desperate, raw, tearing at the carefully constructed walls around my heart. I know you didn't, Paige. I choked out, my own eyes burning with unshed tears. I know. And that's why this is the hardest decision I've ever made. But I can't carry this resentment anymore. It's unfair to you, I know, but it's poisoning me. And I can't build a safe, healthy life for my daughter on ground that is still connected to this, to any of it. Carter, his voice surprisingly gentle now, spoke. Audrey, we understand. It's a lot. But can't we just try? We're here for you. We'll help you through this. You can't, I said, a tear finally escaping and tracing a hot path down my cheek. Not while I'm still feeling like this. I need to sever every single thread. To heal completely, I need to be completely free. This is the only way I know how to protect myself, and more importantly, my daughter, from ever being hurt like this again. The sobs on the other end became uncontrollable. Audrey, please, Paige begged, her voice dissolving into pure anguish. I'm sorry, Paige, I whispered, the words a raw, painful farewell. I'm so sorry. I hung up. The phone dropped onto the sofa cushion, a silent echo of the finality of my act. The profound grief that crashed over me was oceanic, vast and suffocating. I had lost my husband, my home, my future. And now, my sister, my first, my truest protector. The one person who had been a constant in a life of chaos. The bond forged in childhood trauma, strengthened by years of unwavering loyalty, was now severed by my own hand. It felt like tearing off a limb, a necessary amputation to save the rest of my body, but agonizing nonetheless. The tears I had held back for days now streamed freely, a torrent of sorrow for everything I had lost, and for the life I was now forced to abandon to save my own. I was truly alone now, and the weight of that loneliness, coupled with the immense, self-inflicted pain of cutting off my sister, was almost unbearable. But I had to. For my baby, for the new fortress I was determined to build, brick by solitary, tear-soaked brick. The phone call with Paige was the final, agonizing cut. Once the echo of her broken pleas faded, A stark, almost clinical clarity descended upon me. There was no going back, only forward. The decision, though brutal, had been made. And now it was time for the cold, hard work of dismantling a life to build a new one. The very next morning, before the sun had fully risen, I was on the phone to a real estate agent, my voice steady, betraying none of the internal tremors that still shook me. Dean's text message, crude as it was, provided the leverage I needed. A lawyer quickly ensured the transfer of the house into my name. A purely transactional process devoid of human warmth, echoing the nature of his abandonment. Then came the packing. Each box I filled was a deliberate act of exorcism. Our wedding album, once cherished, was now a heavy tome of lies, tucked away in the deepest corner of a storage bin. His clothes, his books, his forgotten trinkets, all meticulously sorted, donated, or simply thrown away. The process was agonizing, a slow, methodical dissection of our shared life. Every item, every photograph, every piece of furniture held a memory, now tainted, twisted by the bitter truth. I'd run my hand over the wooden kitchen counter where we'd laughed over late-night meals, or trace the outline of the window where we'd watched the snow fall, and a fresh wave of nausea would rise. This wasn't just a house, it was the physical embodiment of my broken dreams, a fortress built on sand. And now I was its demolisher. My swollen belly was a constant, heavy reminder of what I was carrying, both physically and emotionally. The sheer exhaustion was immense, but a fierce, protective instinct propelled me forward. This wasn't for me alone. It was for the tiny life kicking within. A life that deserved a new beginning, untainted by the ghosts of the past. The nursery, once a canvas for our shared hopes, became a poignant symbol of what could have been. I carefully packed the untouched baby clothes, the tiny shoes, the soft blankets, each one a whisper of the future. A future I would now face alone, leaving the only real home I had ever known. The one place where I had felt truly safe with Dean was like shedding a skin, raw and painful, but necessary for growth. I chose a town hundreds of miles north, a place I'd only ever seen on maps, a small dot in a vast, anonymous landscape. It had good schools, a quiet community, and, most importantly, no history of Audrey and Dean, no trace of Paige, no echoes of the betrayal that had nearly consumed me. It was a blank slate, daunting in its emptiness, but exhilarating in its promise. The day of the move was a blur of frantic activity. The movers came, their impersonal efficiency, a strange comfort. I did a final walkthrough of the empty house, the silence amplifying its barrenness. The echoes of laughter, of whispered promises, now sounded like mocking taunts. I touched the cold walls, a final, silent goodbye to the innocent version of myself who had believed in an unbreakable fortress. Then, with a deep, shaky breath, I climbed into my car, its trunk filled with the few personal items I couldn't bear to trust to movers, my belly pressing against the steering wheel. The drive was long, stretching across state lines, miles accumulating like layers of distance between me and the wreckage I'd left behind. The landscape changed, subtly at first, then dramatically, transitioning from familiar suburbia to rolling hills and dense forests. Each mile marker was a small victory, a step further into the unknown. There was fear, of course, a chilling dread of starting over, alone, with a baby on the way, in a town where I knew no one. What if I failed? What if I couldn't do it? But interspersed with the fear was a burgeoning sense of independence, a quiet spark of defiant hope. I was doing this. I was driving towards a future of my own making, a future not dictated by someone else's desires or betrayals. The silence of the open road, once intimidating, became a balm, a canvas for imagining possibilities. My hand instinctively rested on my belly. Asterisk. We times would do this. Asterisk. We times would build a new fortress, stronger than the last, because its foundations would be laid with my own unwavering resolve, not on borrowed love or deceptive promises, as the unfamiliar street signs began to appear, signaling my arrival. A single, solitary tear traced a path down my cheek, not of sorrow, but of an overwhelming, fierce determination. I was scared, yes, but for the first time in months I also felt irrevocably, utterly free. My new town, a patchwork of quiet streets and unfamiliar faces, welcomed me with a hesitant quietude. The initial days were a blur of practicalities, finding a small, slightly worn apartment that overlooked a quiet park, navigating lease agreements, and coordinating the delivery of my few possessions. It wasn't the spacious, carefully chosen home Dean and I had planned, but it was mine. Every modest piece of furniture I bought, every box I unpacked, felt like a deliberate act of reclaiming ownership, not just of a physical space, but of my future. I painted the small second bedroom a soft, hopeful yellow, carefully assembling the second-hand crib I'd found. Each screw tightened with a fierce, protective intent. The silence in the evenings was profound, sometimes lonely, but it was a clean silence, untainted by lies or unspoken betrayals. Here, I could breathe. Here, I could start building, not on the ashes of what was, but on the firm, unyielding ground of my own resolve. This new, humble dwelling was to be our sanctuary, a safe haven where Lily would never know the shadow of deceit. The overwhelming moment of pure, unconditional love arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, after 22 grueling hours of labor. It was just me and the nurses. Their kind, encouraging voices, a comforting backdrop to the intense physical struggle. There was no husband to hold my hand, no partner to whisper words of encouragement, but I found a raw, primal strength within me, fueled by the tiny life I was fighting to bring into the world. When her first cry pierced the air, a sound both fragile and utterly powerful, a wave of emotion so profound it bordered on agony washed over me. They placed her on my chest, a small, pink, perfect being, and everything else, Dean, Paige, the betrayal, the pain, vanished. All that existed was her, my daughter, Lily. Her tiny hand instinctively grasped my finger, her eyes, wide and clear, staring up at me with an innocence that cleansed my soul. In that instant, I knew I was no longer alone. I was a mother, and that identity, fiercely claimed, was stronger than any pain the world had inflicted. She was my anchor, my purpose, my reason for being. Single motherhood was a baptism by fire, a relentless cycle of sleepless nights, endless feedings, and the constant buzzing anxiety of sole responsibility. There were moments of profound exhaustion, tears shed in the quiet dark when the weight felt unbearable, when I yearned for a partner, for just a moment of shared burden. But then Lily would stir, or let out a tiny gurgle, or simply open her eyes and gaze at me with that same unwavering trust, and the weariness would recede, replaced by a surge of fierce, unwavering love. I learned to change diapers with one hand, to make coffee while holding a sleeping infant, to find moments of profound joy in the smallest things. Her first smile, the sound of her innocent laughter, the feel of her soft hair against my cheek. My daughter, my beautiful Lily, was not a burden. She was the most precious gift, a constant reminder of the strength I possessed, the love I was capable of. She was, quite simply, my new fortress, not a fortress built of stone and lies, but one woven from unbreakable threads of pure love, resilience, and unwavering dedication. Every time I held her, every time I saw her tiny face light up with recognition, I felt an almost physical reinforcement of my own spirit. This fortress was built on times my time's terms, on times my time's foundation of independence and self-worth. It wasn't impenetrable to the world's harshness, but it was impenetrable to the kind of betrayal that had shattered my past. We were a unit, a complete, self-sufficient world unto ourselves, and as I watched her grow, day by day, discovering the world with innocent wonder, I knew, with a certainty that reached into my bones, that I had not just survived, I had thrived, and in her presence, I found a joy and a purpose so profound, so pure, that it eclipsed every shadow of the past, paving the way for a future as bright and as hopeful as her own sparkling eyes. That boundless love, that unwavering purpose, Lily ignited within me, became the lens through which I viewed every painful decision that led me here. Years have passed since those harrowing days, since the final agonizing cuts were made, and with each passing season, with every milestone Lily reaches, my conviction solidifies. I have no regrets about the choices I made, despite the profound, lingering ache they left behind. The pain of severing ties with Paige, my first protector, my only family, remains a scar that sometimes throbs in quiet moments. It was an unjust wound, inflicted by my hand upon an innocent person, yet it was a necessary one. That unfair resentment I battled, the one that made me feel so monstrous, was in truth a raw nerve, screaming for self-preservation. To have remained connected, to have allowed their shadows to stretch across our new life, would have been to build my daughter's fortress on quicksand. I knew, with every fiber of my being, that for Lily to have a truly untainted beginning, I had to ensure her world was entirely free of the architects of my past suffering. It was an act of brutal love, for both of us, through the crucible of abandonment and betrayal. A different kind of strength emerged within me. It wasn't the stoic resilience Paige had modeled, the kind that absorbs blows. It was a fierce, roaring power, born of having nothing left to lose and everything to protect. I learned to trust my instincts, to rely solely on my own judgment, to become the unwavering protector for Lily that Paige had once been for me. The vulnerability I once abhorred, the feeling of being utterly exposed, slowly transformed into a quiet confidence. I had faced the absolute worst and survived. Not just survived, but rebuilt. The woman who had once defined herself by the love she received now understood that her truest power lay in the love she gave and the boundaries she set. My greatest dedication now, beyond simply providing for Lily, is to instill in her the very lessons I learned through such devastating hardship. We talk openly about feelings, about standing up for yourself, about recognizing the quiet whispers of intuition when something feels wrong. I teach her that her worth is inherent, not dependent on anyone else's affection or validation. I show her, every single day, what a healthy, loving, respectful relationship looks like. A relationship built on honesty and trust, not hidden desires and placating lies. I tell her that it's okay to walk away from anything or anyone that diminishes her light, even if it hurts. Because self-preservation is not selfish. It is essential. Our fortress now isn't one of brick and mortar, or even of shared history, but one built on the bedrock of unconditional love, fierce independence, and unwavering hope. Lily, with her sparkling eyes and infectious laugh, is the embodiment of that hope. She is my constant reminder that even from the ashes of the most profound betrayals, something beautiful, authentic, and truly invincible can rise. The past may have been a tempest, but the future is a clear sky, vast and full of boundless possibility, crafted not by fate, but by the determined hand of a survivor, and that, I've learned, is a peace more precious than any fleeting happiness.